of the interesting things in this case has to do with Duray Richards' 1976 Ford Elite Torino. This big boat of a car. I guess the police were able to put that car at the scene where Marshall disappeared.
Yes.
But I take it you have found problems with that.
We have, and so again, that's a sort of thread of evidence that the Crown used quite powerfully at the trial before this jury to say we have a few different ways in which we say Richard's car is at the shack, the little house where the victim was last seen. It seems that she was taken from the shack. She had some everyday items that were left in plain sight and so on. So it looks like she disappeared from there fairly quickly. So they had evidence to say we were looking to link that to being Richard's, as you say, 76 Ford Grand Torino Elite car. One of those pieces of evidence was that there was a power pole that seemed to have some sort of a bump or scrape right out front of the shack, and there was a piece of wood that was the same type of wood, red cedar, that was the wood used for on the power pole or the telephone line. So that, and then there was some tire evidence. The police came and looked. A friend of the deceased pointed out tire marks that seemed to be new since she'd been there, and said, and it seemed logical, it seemed obvious those must be the vehicle marks from the car that took her. So that was put forward at trial to say, well, we've got links in terms of the wood damage as well as wood found on the vehicle, Richard's car. And we have these tire marks, and they had an expert, a so-called expert, it was really just the guy from the tire store, but a so-called expert to say those are the tire marks that match up to Richard's car.
Was the Ford larger than the tire tracks that were present, or smaller?
Yeah, even though it was a big old sort of 1970s beater type of car, it was an old rusty beat up car at that point. But the vehicle that had pulled into the shack and presumably taken the victim was significantly wider. So we think a larger vehicle or truck.
The tire marks that you mentioned, the tread marks that were analyzed by this Big O tire employee, who was, I understand, a roommate of Richard's as well. Was he qualified to make that sort of analysis?
Well, yeah, that he was. He was qualified in this sense. At the trial, he was put forward and tendered as an expert opinion type of evidence. The usual rule is a witness can't sort of set into court and describe their own opinions about the world unless they have expertise in the area. They're qualified as an expert. This thing was sort of reminds me of My Cousin Vinny or something. You've got people coming into court and opining about tire tracks, but even stranger than fiction here, the tire track expert wasn't someone brought in from Calgary or Vancouver or someone who had experience testifying and identifying this sort of evidence. This was literally the guy who worked at the tire store, who'd actually been factually involved on two levels. One, putting on new tires when Richards got the Grand Torino, and two, because he was Richards' roommate for a period. So that was absolutely a bizarre piece. In the application of the minister, one of the issues we raise is that, and this isn't true just of this, but on a number of levels, what was put forward as being expert evidence by today's standards would simply not be allowed. Things happened here at this trial in 1994 in Cranbrook that would never be countenanced today.
So setting aside for a second the distance between the tires issue or problem, you know, would that car have been able to make it up the logging road where Carrie Louise Marshall was eventually found dead?
We're very skeptical of that. We don't have any, the car isn't around for us to run a new test today or recreate it. The police tried to recreate that. I think that suggests to us they had some doubt about that. This is such a rusty old thing. It was a 1976 car. This incident occurred December of '92. The incident occurred early December, so obviously winter, in Creston in the Purcell Mountain area. There was, as I recall it, snow on the ground at sort of -10 to -15 types of temperatures at the time, so proper winter driving conditions, and a very steep logging access road where even the big trucks with all of their weight and many wide tires would put chains on to access their way up that road. So the car was described as going about 3 or 4 kilometers up the logging road to where the deceased was found.
Was that during the test, the police test?
Sorry, that was the theory of the Crown and the
Oh, I see.
police that they ran at trial, that Richards took his car up and that's where the body was left. But when they did a test about a year later, a little bit earlier, it was warmer conditions. It was actually above 0, so not as harsh conditions. One of the tests they did in the middle of the day. Another one they did, I think, in the evening time. And they had a great deal, and more than that, they had the car in a heated garage. They'd serviced it to some extent, replaced the fluids. They'd made observations about the carburetor and the choke working or not working and warming up the car. So they hadn't revamped the engine, but they'd made some efforts to sort of best increase their chances of that old car getting up the logging road. And then, quite amazingly, the report is that they had a great deal of difficulty on the first test, that the car was going roughly 2 to 3 miles per hour for a period of time. It was really struggling and sort of, it sounds almost like a walking pace, that this car was just crawling its way along, again, in better conditions and having been serviced. So when we look at that, we say, how could it be that in the dark of night, in real winter driving conditions, the Crown theory is the car had no difficulty getting up and back down that road.
There's other evidence at trial that was quite interesting. One of them was a sweater that apparently belonged to Carrie Louise Marshall. Her mother said that she was wearing it the last time she was seen, essentially.
Yeah.
On the day of the last time she was seen.
Yeah.
And then that somehow ended up in the possession of a friend of Richards, who claimed that Richards had given it to her the day after the disappearance. It seems like compelling evidence.
It does, and that's a good example, and this is where this case has so many elements where you hear something like that and think, well, that really only makes sense with him being the real killer. How could he have possession of victim's sweater and then a day after the fact be giving it to another woman? That sure sounds like a compelling piece of evidence. In our application is quite a long written document, but it goes on at some length to analyze that and say, well, it sounds compelling at first blush, but when you examine it and look at it, that witness who gave that account, it's really only the one witness, and that evidence is rife with inconsistencies with other external evidence. The story changed. At different points in time, the story was, I don't know how the sweater got there. I assume maybe it was from Richards, but I don't know. At one point, the theory was that the witness said the sweater was handed to me, but at different points she said it showed up in a bag. I don't know how it got there. The timing of it changed. And like so many things, I think for Richards, what he has always seen through his trial process was the screws really got tightened in more and more and more. And as evidence evolved, and it really evolved on the sweater point, it always seemed to evolve in the same direction. It always seemed to be that the Crown's case got stronger and stronger. So by the time of the trial on the sweater point, that sounded like a very strong piece of evidence.